Welcome everybody, I'm Sega Lord X, and I wanted to do an episode that covers the first 10 games that I think you should buy when you become a Saturn owner. This is basically for new guys who are just getting into the system or are thinking about getting into the system. What do you go after first? Everybody on YouTube trumps up all these super expensive games. I'm not going to do that. The first 10 games that you should buy for the Sega Saturn are not only really good games, all of them are also fairly inexpensive to super inexpensive. So, let's look at the first 10 games you should buy for the Sega Saturn. Alright, the first game that you should get for the system is an absolute no-brainer. It was the best-selling game for the system. It's really easy to find no matter what region you're in, and it's cheap. So definitely look for this one, and that is Virtua Fighter 2. Japanese and US versions, even the European version is cheap of this particular game. A lot of copies were sold, a lot of copies were given away with systems and special promotions. It has driven the price way down on this one. It's still a marvel to look at to me. I love to see it running. It's so smooth. The music is great. It's timeless gameplay if you like Virtua Fighter style gameplay. And I mean, just everything about the game oozes that Sega quality. Most gamers in the West didn't care about it, but it's still a great game. You definitely should put it on your list as one of the first games that you want to get. Alright, moving right along to number 2 is the Panzer Dragoon games. And I don't mean Panzer Dragoon Saga, obviously, because Saga is super expensive. The good news is, though, is that Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2 right here in Japan is so inexpensive. They are very easy to play. Vast majority of the options are in English, and the story to Panzer Dragoon is so out there and nonsensical. You're a dragon blowing stuff up. That's all you need to know about. That's all you need to care about. And these games are must-owns on the Saturn. They look great, they sound great, they play great. They're very different from any other style of game that was really released at the time. There's very few other games outside of this series that are actually like Panzer Dragoon. And there's an art style, and there's just this artistic expression in everything Panzer Dragoon does. And it's almost like just hypnotic when you're sitting there watching it and listening to it. And it grips you, and you're like, wow, this world, man. That's why the story doesn't matter. You're just gripped by this artistic just blowout of your senses, and it's like, wow, look at this world, look at these weird enemies. You know, obviously I am supposed to get on this dragon and kill these really bad guys, and that's all that really mattered in the game. So Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2, go for the import versions. The import versions are so inexpensive. They definitely are the way to play the games. You don't need to throw out hundreds of dollars for them, and in my opinion, the art style kills the US and European boxes. Now moving on, the Sega Saturn had some killer light gun games. And this is in part due to the fact that the Sega Saturn had a killer light gun. And this particular entry comes with the caveat, you need the light gun. And that light gun is the Sega Saturn Stunner. This one here I've owned for a while. It is new in box. I've never opened it or touched it. I own a few more, but this is the gun you want for your Sega Saturn. It is the best light gun ever made, in my opinion. It is so accurate, so awesome to hold. It is just pretty much just the perfect light gun in every single way. Now, once you get your light gun, that's going to open you up to 2 very good games. And I'm going to count this as one entry because both of these games are really cheap. And that is Virtua Cop 1 and 2. These are another series of games that are really easy to import with mostly English options. Not to mention, again, the box art kills the Western releases. These games are so cheap. If I'm not mistaken, I think I bought mine when I got my second copies. I think I paid maybe $5 a piece for them. Man, they are killer games for $5 a piece. Now, there is another caveat here, and that is, of course, light guns only work on CRTs, or at least the old light gun technology only works on CRTs. So if you only have LCD tech in your house now, you're kind of screwed on these. So you can still play them with the controller, but man, does that change the experience completely, and it's not the same. I still recommend you pick the Virtual Cop games up just because they are so good, they are so fun, but not having the Saturn stunner really does affect the quality of the game. But if you do have a CRT in the house, man, I cannot recommend those two games enough. They are awesome with 2 players. Definitely give it a try. Now, one thing that you should know about the Saturn is that the Saturn had great racing games on it, particularly from Sega. And there's one game on it that a lot of people love, including myself, and that is Sega Rally. Now, Sega Rally, US and Japanese, are both mainly in English. Very easy to import. Very, very cheap in every region. There's a few different versions of them. There's a Netlink version as well. The Japanese version is a little more complete than the US version. The Japanese version has a couple of background polygons and a few scenes. There's a few changes here and there in like where the crowds are located and whatnot. It's a slightly tweaked game. The Netlink edition in Japan that came out is further tweaked a little bit with things similar to that. And this game rocks. It is an absolute kick-ass racing game. Graphically, it's some of the best racing game graphics on the system. It's ultra smooth. The game handling is so incredibly good. Really easy to get into. It's just that type of game that you can pick up. You'll bump into the wall a bunch of times, but you'll start to get that feel for it. And before you know it, man, you're sliding all over that track and you are just loving the sound bites to it that add so much. And the music to it is just so Sega, you know, mid-90s. It's just sort of out there Japanese stuff, you know, and it really makes the game enjoyable. Like I said, cheap game, easy to import, so much fun to play, and you gotta have a racing game for your Saturn. Definitely check out Sega Rally. Okay, you gotta have that great multiplayer game on the Saturn, right? And there's some great multiplayer games on the Saturn, but a lot of them cost a lot of money. But not this one. And that is Decathlete. US and Japan again. Dirt cheap. Decathlete is an awesome game, especially in multiplayer. It's a track and field style game. It's that kind of game that it's so easy to play, but so incredibly hard to master. It's one of those games you'll jump into it. You won't do particularly well at first. You're kind of scratching your head. How do I do that? 3-4 tries later, you're like, oh, I get the hang of this. And then when you add a friend in, wow, man, just the fun factor just shoots through the roof. And again, the games are so cheap. Japanese versions like $5. You might pay $15 for the US version. I think the European version is cheap too. It's just such a great game. And another thing about the game is it runs in Virtua Fighter 2's high res mode. So the game still looks fantastic. When you have it on a CRT, it's got that shimmer of the high resolution that Saturn games had, and it just looks so cool, and the frame rate was so awesome, man. It's like you're watching it and it's like, man, there's nothing like that on the PlayStation 1, because there wasn't. How many 704 by 5 whatever the hell it was resolution games were on the PlayStation that ran at 60 frames. The Saturn had those games, and it was the only system at the time that had them. So Decathlete, man, definitely give that one a look. Now my next game is a bit of an outlier. It's a puzzle game, and it's like, why are you throwing in a puzzle game? Because this is an awesome puzzle game, and it's a puzzle game that is so cheap, and it's so easy to import, and that is Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. This is an awesome puzzle game. I know you guys have been around for a while. You have to have played this game. The Saturn version is a gorgeous version of the game. The Japanese version is fairly cheap. It's under 20 bucks, and you can't go wrong with it. It's in English. Most of it is in English. It is a great two-player game, and it's just so easy to add to your collection right up front. It gives you that genre covered. It is just, it's one of Capcom's best outside their normal series games, you know what I mean? It was such an unexpected game from Capcom. It was just sort of like, Capcom did this kind of game. It sort of reminds me of the Quiz and Dragons games that they did in the arcade. Those games were awesome too. They were just so different from the normal stuff that Capcom did. Definitely look at Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo though. Like I said, easy to import, no language barrier, awesome two-player mode, great graphics and sound, easy game to add. Alright, moving on. Every sort of system, when you first get it, you want that role-playing strategy, you know, that game that's out of the norm that you can put a little bit of time into, right? Now the Sega Saturn, unfortunately, role-playing games tend to be ultra expensive. Usually these guys are hundreds of dollars. They have huge import restrictions because the language barrier, I mean, it more or less breaks the game from importing it. You have to use a guide. And doing that really cuts the fun factor for a lot of those games. Fortunately, the English versions of this game are affordable. Typically under $50, and it is a fantastic game. And that game is Mysterio. This is the first role-playing strategy game that you want to buy for your Saturn. It's affordable, and it is a great game. It is so overlooked. I cannot even begin to tell you how overlooked it is. Now, if Working Designs had done Mysterio, and it had had a cool foil cover with that real thick, you know, instruction manual like, you know, Working Designs like to do, and the disc had had that beautiful artwork on it like Working Designs games typically had, Mysterio would be a $300 game. I am absolutely positive of it. But it wasn't. The artwork on the disc sucked. The box art sucked. And it's an overlooked game. You know, it's one of those games that just flies under the radar. Nobody ever thinks about it. The game has a fantastic story once you get into it. Once you learn the gameplay and the level up system, and you start to collect characters into your group, and each one has its own little backstory, and you start gaining with battle, you start gaining all these moves that you can do, and all of a sudden this simple little, you know, turn-based strategy RPG all of a sudden just blossoms into this epic game with backstories and side stories, and, you know, just this gameplay that is so incredibly deep, where you're moving in with your party, and, you know, you've got the tank character who is just busting in and just can take all this damage, and you have the healer sort of skirting the battle, healing everybody, and you've got the long range guys, you know, archery powers that are just tearing up guys from the distance. Man, it is just this synergy of gameplay that is just so incredibly overlooked, man. There are games, role-playing games and strategy games on the Saturn that sell for 3, 4, 5 times what Mysterio sells for and are not as good games. You know, so Mysterio was also known as Blazing Heroes due to a lawsuit. It was released later as Blazing Heroes. The import version was actually called Riglord Saga, but it's kind of tough to play because so much of it is in heavy Japanese. You can play it with a guide. I did when it very first come out, but I mean, honestly, it's one of those games where the US version is so fairly inexpensive. I've seen Mysterio go disc only as cheap as 20 or 25 bucks. And if you want to roll into it that way and then pick up Riglord Saga as your case, because actually Riglord Saga is a double case. It's got an empty case in the back. It's just a 1 CD game, as you can see right there, which means that if you wanted to get that disc only US version, you could just throw it right there in the second part of the case and you could have a complete Japanese and English Mysterio. However you want to do it, man, don't look this game over. If you like strategy role-playing games at all, it is a can't miss game. Definitely give it a look. Now the next game is one of those games that there's a lot of people that don't like it, and I can kind of understand it, to be perfectly honest with you. It's a very weird game. I'm not even sure. I mean, I don't even know how you would even place it in a genre. You know, it's just that strange of a game. And that is Nights into Dreams. Now, if you guys are familiar with the Saturn at all, this was one of the, or supposed to be one of the Saturn's killer apps. And a lot of people didn't see it that way. It was a game that it played very weirdly. It didn't have the appeal of a Sonic or a Mario game. So why do you need it on your Saturn? Honestly, it's one of those games where Nights is more than the sum of its parts. There's an artistic value to Nights. There's a freedom to Nights gameplay that is, it's really hard to put your finger on. It's hard to explain it to somebody. But you take control in a side-scrolling level. You're playing on a 2D plane for the most part. There's a couple of 3D-esque sections, but it's mainly on a 2D plane. But the world is polygonal, and you're flying around the world and you're collecting these orbs to open up the next part of the stage, which opens the next part of the stage until you get to a boss. And that's basically all the game is. If you're looking at it on paper, you're kind of wondering to yourself, you know, what the hell is this? Why does this appeal? Who does this appeal to? And again, it's just one of those games where how it feels, how it is visually presented, how the audio cues change and go along with the levels you're in, and the boss encounters especially, man. There's something about Nights that just has a very special and tangible quality to it. You jump into it, you get this freedom of flight, you're collecting things, the stage is very colorful, very weirdly set up worlds, very strange enemies, and it just has this, I don't know, it's almost like this therapeutic, you know, gameplay to it, where it's just like, I'm just going to collect stuff, oh, and open up the next world, and oh, there's a boss, and there's just that almost dreamlike quality, you know, to Nights, and there's a ton of stuff to open up in it. And if you want to, grab Christmas Nights with it. Christmas Nights was sort of a demo type game that was Christmas themed, and depending on what time of year it was, it can be themed to other holidays as well. The nice thing is that Nights import right there is really cheap. You can get it for next to nothing, and it's an easy game to import. No language barrier whatsoever, man. The story again is typical Sega nonsense. You don't really need it. It doesn't even matter when you could understand it, you know, in English. And it's just, you jump into the game and you know how to play it. It's just that simple of a game. It's also one of the games that sort of, I don't know, it's Sonic's replacement for lack of any better explanation. It's the game that sort of the Saturn relied on as its mascot title. It really didn't have anything else. That was the character, that was the game that Sonic Team churned out. No Sonic game, but Knights. But anyway, Knights. Easy to import, very, very inexpensive game. Christmas Nights is a good complement to it. Definitely part of the Saturn's history and a good game to import, just like I said, for that intangible artistic quality that some Sega games had at the time. Now, as we all know, the Saturn had a fantastic shoot-'em-up library, man. Just so many games, so many different kinds of shooters, so many different variances in art style, in speed, in quality. Just, you know, it was so many games. Where do you start? What's the first one you should buy for the Saturn? Now, I'm a big fan of Layer Section. I love that game. But Layer Section is kind of one of those games that, I mean, I've noticed it has mixed appeal with a lot of people. The lock-on technique for that game can get kind of fatiguing for people, and they don't see it in the same light as I do. However, Tsukio Gorentai is definitely one of those games that you should look at for the Saturn for a number of reasons. Number one, it is a perfect arcade port. It was done on the Saturn's arcade big brother, the STV Titan, and the quality of the translation, wow, it is just spot on. Second you put it in, you're looking at it, you're like, wow, this game looks really good. Even now, the game looks really good. It has this great mix of 2D and 2D graphics and 3D polygons. The gameplay is really easy to get into. The game doesn't overwhelm you in the beginning, you know, it's not one of those shooters that just bullet hells you to death and just crushes your soul by the end of the second stage. The difficulty has a very good curve to it, where it starts out manageable and gradually starts to really pound you. But the game is great, and it's not expensive. Tsukio Gorentai can be had for around $50, man. Sometimes cheaper than $50. That is incredible for a Sega Saturn shooter of that particular quality. I guarantee you, if you are a shoot 'em up fan and you grab this game on your Saturn, you are going to absolutely be thankful that you did. Lots of replay value, great graphics and sound. It's just one of those games that when you fire it up, it's like, wow, the Saturn really did have some horsepower to it. Alright, now, the Sega Saturn had a ton of great 2D fighters, right? And I haven't recommended one. So, what's the entry point for 2D fighters on the Saturn? What's the first one you want to buy? Well, here, I didn't even have to second guess this. I knew exactly what I wanted to recommend the second the thought hit my mind. And that is Street Fighter Collection. Make sure it's the Japanese one. Street Fighter Collection for the Japanese Sega Saturn. Why Japanese? The language barrier doesn't make any difference at all. It's very easy to play. Most of the options are in English or easy to figure out because you kind of know where everything should be. The story, it's Street Fighter, you know the damn story, and it's cheap. Street Fighter Collection in Japan can be gotten for like 30 bucks, 35 bucks, and the bang for your buck is really unbelievable. The first disc in this collection right here is Super Street Fighter and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. And there's a lot of gameplay between those two games. You're going to love the Saturn version of those games. They play great, they sound great. But the big bonus to this collection outside of those two games is on the second disc. right there. And that is Street Fighter 02 Dash. Now, they called it Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, I think, in the US. And it is a tweaked, extra character, couple extra modes version of the original Street Fighter Alpha 2 or Street Fighter 02. And it's got a mode in it called Goki mode or Akuma mode here in the West. And wow, is that mode hard, man. He's one of those characters where he's able to cut his animation so that he can just roll moves one after the other, you know, so it really doesn't give you time to punish him for missing something. When he misses something, he's already in the animation for something else, so he's utterly devastating you. You know, average Street Fighter players, man, are just gonna get mauled by this boss mode, man. It is really tough, and you have to have some skills in Street Fighter 02 to even think about beating that guy. It is great fun though, because it really tests your skills. Play the regular game, get good at it, pump the difficulty up in the regular mode. Once you're beating the hardest difficulty setting, man, move on over to Goki mode, Akuma mode, and really test your skills out. That character is unbelievably hard, and he will whoop your ass for a while before you beat him. But anyway, Street Fighter Collection, man. Japanese version, $35, perfect entry point into 2D gaming or 2D fighting on the Saturn. Alright guys, I want to close out this video by just saying thanks for watching. This video I had been wanting to do for a while. I wanted to do it a little bit different. I just wanted to sort of share with you what are the first 10 games, and I know I cheated there a little bit. I kind of doubled up on games in the same series, but what are the first 10 games roughly that you should pick up for your Saturn that aren't going to destroy your bank account? And I think those games just represent the Sega Saturn in such a positive light. Some of those games a lot of people don't know or realize just how good they are. They're the kind of games that when you first cut them on, you're sort of proud that they're on the Saturn. It's like, wow, man, you know, the Saturn had some oomph. The Saturn had some power. The Saturn had a reason to own it. You know, it sort of makes you feel like it's a justifier, these games. You know, they help you realize that, hey, you know, the PlayStation had its games and that was totally cool, but these games on the Saturn, man, these games were awesome. These, even when the PlayStation did get a version of these games, often the Saturn version was better, and you really couldn't say that a lot in that generation, man. Most of the time it was the other way around. But these Saturn versions, man, they held their own or were better than PlayStation 1 versions. And that was really important to Sega Saturn fans at the time, because Saturn fans didn't get a lot of wins in those days, man. You know, most of the time it was just pain and heartbreak, like, oh, we're not getting this game, or oh, our version sucks, or, you know, it was always something like that. But anyway, those 10 games, man, I don't think you can go wrong with them. Great games, and I am Sega Lord X. Appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you next time.